Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director at Breakthrough. Before we get started, another quick reminder, a couple weeks from now, my producer Tali Perlman and I will be hosting Breakthrough Dialogues' first AMA or Ask Me Anything episode. So if you have any questions you'd like us to answer, please email us at info@thebreakthrough.org or tweet us at the BTI or at @Trembath. We'll be collecting questions over the coming weeks, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. For this episode, I spoke to Bryan Walsh about his new book, End Times, A Brief Guide to the End of the World. Bryan was a foreign correspondent, reporter, and editor at Time magazine for over 15 years, where he covered the SARS epidemic, climate change, extinction, and more. I've been following Bryan's work since about a decade ago when I discovered his writing on U.S. climate politics, and I can enthusiastically recommend his new book, which was published in the United States last week. Bryan Walsh, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here.
So you've spent much of your career reporting on climate and energy, and that's how I got to know you. So the idea that you would write a book on the end of the world wasn't super surprising to me. I followed your work for more than a decade, and I found much of the chapter in your book on climate change pretty familiar. This is what I read and think about day in, day out. But you didn't write a book about climate change. You wrote a book about the end of the world. Asteroids, volcanoes, artificial intelligence, extraterrestrial life, pandemics, on and on. So my first question was, did climate change get you interested in these other subjects, or was it something about the essence of the end times that made you want to write this book?
Oh, it was definitely climate change that was kind of the entry point into this subject. I did spend time, before I was a climate change writer, I was a foreign correspondent in Asia, and I did report on the SARS epidemic, and that kind of introduced me to the issue of infectious disease, which is something that we talk about here in the book. But it was really always climate change that was enabled me to actually start thinking on a global scale, thinking not just that, thinking on a future scale as well. It's really a subject, as you know, that is always going to be future focused. What's going to happen to this species in 10, 20, 100, 200 years or longer. So that was sort of my ability to sort of begin to look at it that way. And then I saw that there was a lot more than climate change. When you really got to looking at this, I began to discover the whole field of existential risk, which had really begun, it sort of took shape, I think, in the way we think of it now. In the early part of the 21st century, you started to see institutions that were focused on this subject. And then I just sort of discovered one after the other and sort of being able to put them all together. And I figured if you're going to go for your first book, why not go for as large a subject as possible?
Yeah, you mentioned a bunch of those newer organizations working on this stuff in your book, Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, the Future of Life Institute, the Long Now Foundation. So can you tell us sort of what is the work being done to understand and prepare for the end of the world?
I think that what those institutions are doing is really trying to create cross-disciplinary efforts to understand, compare, contrast these risks. What are the things we should actually be concerned about, especially looking at not just the natural risks that have always been in there in the background, I'd say, but looking really at what are the human-made risks that we should be concerned about. New technologies like AI, which I think is really the starting point for a lot of these groups, but also some new advances in biotechnology, nanotechnology as well. Then, of course, looking at subjects that have been with us for some time, like nuclear war, that seemed like it was a thing of the past. Now it's something, obviously, we're quite concerned about. And what they all have in common, and what this book also really tries to really go at, is we're at this place, I think, where on one hand, as I note, I think you guys would agree with that, materially we're better off than we've ever really been as a species on this planet right now, right here. At the same time, the risk of, an existential risk, the risk of something truly bad happening is probably higher than it's really ever been throughout our species. That's because you have cosmic background risks that have always been with us, but that now we can actually do something about. We can do something about asteroids. We can even begin to prepare for something like a supervolcano eruption. But then, of course, we're creating new risks with technology, whether it's climate change, whether it's AI, whether it's biotechnology. And that puts us in a very difficult situation. And what those groups, I think, we're trying to do is look and say, look, no one's really been looking at this as a concrete subject. Nick Bostrom, who's kind of the doyen of this field, had paper that started this whole thing off, where he looked and saw, and there was more studies done about, I believe, was sea slugs or something along those, something really, really sort of minute in biology as compared to existential risk as a whole. And there's really no subject more important than the future of humanity and whether it'll actually have a future.
Yeah, I think you end up categorizing different types of existential risk really interestingly throughout the book. So I want to ask you to flesh that out for us a little bit more. You mentioned that there are these sort of background cosmic risks like asteroids that, while we may be much better able to detect them now, we may not be able to do a whole lot to prevent a cataclysmic asteroid strike.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are other things. There are things like pandemics that have been with humanity, for the whole of our existence, but that we might actually be making worse through things like our own medicine, like antibiotics, and through things like the creation of superbugs and things like that. And then there are, what I think of as new risks that are created by the mitigation of old risks. So, I think of climate change largely as one of those risks, where we by dramatically increasing our consumption of fossil fuels and our use of industrial agriculture and other things, we have, sort of, as you say, helped dramatically lower or come close to eliminating global hunger, dramatically lower global poverty. But we've created this new risk, even as we have improved our material well-being. We have created this new, possibly quite devastating existential risk in global climate change. So, so how do you group those different types of end times, and what do those different groupings have to tell us about how we think and deal with those problems?
I'd say the main way I classified them was by looking at where do they come from. So when you have something that starts out the book, asteroids and supervolcanoes, these are sort of, I'd say, classic ones. I mean, there's a reason why a whole bunch of movies have been made about the idea of an asteroid hitting the Earth. There's something very cinematic about that. And of course, we know from what happened to the dinosaurs that is a real danger. Supervolcanoes, less well known, but actually probably a bigger risk over time. And then you look at things like, I put climate change and actually disease in the same kind of category. They're a little different, but basically these are risks where human advances are, if not creating them, they can really worsen them. In the case of climate change, absolutely, it's us putting carbon into the atmosphere as we industrialize, as we continue to grow as a species, as we continue to use up more energy. But of course, it's also the climate itself responding to us. And, how bad that's going to get is going to be a relationship between what we're doing in terms of how we're using energy and how we're dealing with the environment. But of course, also how the climate will respond to us. So you have that interaction as well. And disease, something that comes out of nature, has been with us always, but has killed more human beings than anything else, any war, any other catastrophe. But of course, what we're doing on the Earth right now, whether it's connecting each other through travel, whether it's simply becoming more populous, whether it's using antibiotics in a way that creates entirely new and more dangerous strains of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, that's again where we're amplifying those risks of nature. And then lastly, you have the sort of emerging technology risks, in this case, AI, biotechnology. And these are ones that are really solely coming from human beings, that would only exist on this planet because we create certain advances. We create something like gene editing and CRISPR. We create, obviously, artificial intelligence. And so we introduce something new to the world. Nuclear war is one that I think fits into that as well. It didn't exist before, the Trinity site saw the first atomic bomb tested. So then you have, these are the ones that I think are growing and we're particularly concerned about because they're only going to intensify in the future. As we become more powerful as a species, we're creating new risks, and we're not exactly catching up when it comes to the wisdom you would hope we have in terms of using that technology, whether it's dealing with the future of climate change or whether it's figuring out, what will AI do to us? Not just will it create a super intelligence that's going to take over and turn us all into paper clips, to use the famous example, but could that actually accentuate other risks? Could it make nuclear war more likely as we hook AI into our weapons system or we create autonomous weapons? It has unintended consequences, and that's what we really need to deal with those kind of risks.
So you include in your climate chapter a really great discussion of this concept of discounting the future. So I want to ask you about that. And obviously it's sort of most relevant, I think, to the subject of climate change and has been extremely well studied in terms of the expected risk of climate change weighted against the expected benefit of continued consumption of fossil fuels, and also the very uncertain possibility of climate risk, the very uncertain possibility of technological change. So I want to ask you about this concept of discounting in terms of how it relates to climate change, but also how it might relate to some of these other less predictable and maybe more cataclysmic risks.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the climate change chapter, it was one of the most difficult ones to write, in part because, as you know, it's an incredibly complicated subject, very contentious, obviously. Just, go on Twitter and follow the RCMP 8.5 thread for the next 3 weeks, and you'll see people talking about this in endless detail. But to me, it was an opportunity to really get at one of the central questions of this book, which is, what do we care about the future? Because ultimately, existential risk, when it really gets down to it, yes, obviously we're concerned about us here on this planet, all 7.7 billion of us, and if the world were to disappear tomorrow, we would be the first ones to suffer. But our suffering would be, comparatively far less than the billions, tens of billions, potentially trillions of people who might live if our species doesn't go extinct now. The problem is, of course, and discounting is probably the best way to look at this, we don't really care about the future. We don't care about it really from, I think, arguably a psychological perspective. I mean, I have an example where, you can look at someone in an fMRI tube and you ask them to actually think about themselves. Okay, their brain will light up in sort of a sense of identity. If you ask them to think about themselves, but say 30 years from now, you actually get less activation. That shows that we think of ourselves, our actual, we ourselves, as different people if we're in the future. Now, if you go further ahead, if you go 50, 60, 70 past whatever generation is alive now, then we really don't care that much. And I think discounting, the decline essentially of value in the future is part of that. It's a way of putting a number on that. And it's a representation of that fact that we think that way. How you choose a discount rate, a lot obviously goes into it. Someone who knows a lot more about economics could explain that than me. But really, you're picking what do you value that future? The lower the discount rate, obviously, the more you value the future, the more the damages that might happen in the future matter to you now, here in the present. So, to me, the fact that we've had such a hard time really dealing with climate change, at least, in terms of making present day sacrifices, and discounting enters into that, I think can be extrapolated to a lot of the other risks as well. We're not really preparing for existential risks across the board, whether it's, asteroids or whether it's preparing for the new risks that might be coming from technologies like AI or biotech, in part because we think of those as the problems of the future, and the future is a foreign country that we're sort of, we let take care of itself. And when it comes to economics, we essentially assume, they're going to be richer, they're going to be better off, they'll be more able to deal with this. So why would we, damage ourselves or take any kind of sacrifice now to help them in the future? Which makes sense, I think, in a lot of ways. It doesn't necessarily make sense when you're talking about risking the actual future itself, when you're actually talking about raising the risk of the extinction or the near annihilation of the human species.
I think that's actually sort of a very good characterization of the way that economists tend to think about at least climate change and probably a whole bunch of other long tail or long lead existential risks. You mentioned maybe some I don't know about contrarian, but some differing views on that from economists like Marty Weitzman and others. But again, I think it's fair when it comes to economists. I want to ask, you dig into this new and emerging field of existential risk studies, and for the scholars and professionals in that field or those fields, sort of what is the consensus there, if there is one? Is it that we should just use the revealed preference that we see when we ask people what they care about when we put them in fMRI tubes? Or is the consensus that we should use policies to correct those preferences? Well,
the consensus is definitely you should be using policies to try to correct them. The challenge is figuring out what that should be, actually. And actually, I think most existential risk experts, they don't really rate climate change that high, in part because, yes, that was not to say they don't think climate change is very important. It's not to say they don't see climate change as causing a lot of damage and devastation in the future. They just don't see it comparable to, the also slightly less predictable risks coming from something like a biotechnology, bioweapons, or obviously artificial intelligence. They don't see that climate change as being something that's likely to actually cause the extinction or even even something near to the extinction of humanity. That's in part, I think, because a lot of people in that field tend to be, ironically somewhat actually, because they also raise warnings about AI and so forth, techno-optimists. They really, in part, one of the reasons they're so interested in keeping the species going is because they have a lot of hope that we'll continue to develop new technologies, and we'll create a much better world. It's not just a matter of keeping this sort of status quo going, but rather hoping we can actually reach a point, whether it's the singularity or whatever you want to call it, where we're all living much richer lives, materially richer, hopefully intellectually richer. And so they just don't, they assume, like, essentially, I think it's baked into the system that we'll fix climate change. We will find the technologies to deal with it. Whereas they're worried about something like AI, where it could get out of control, or, in the same way, a nuclear exchange could really get out of control and set us back, or even cause us to go extinct. So that's where those two things, I think, differ. And it's obviously not really so much the mainstream environmental opinion, even if we've seen, I think, a movement towards people saying that this really could cause us to go extinct.
It's funny that you say that this group of experts tends to think of climate change as not a big deal compared to the other existential risks. I spend all my time sort of on climate Twitter amongst people who refer to climate change as, the most dangerous thing that humanity has ever faced, including wars and pandemics of the past. We're coming up towards a presidential election. You have plenty of politicians talking about it in the same way. And they don't talk about nanobots, and they don't talk about AI, and they don't talk about pandemics in the same terms. And I have to assume that that's partially because we don't see the singularity, or even the sort of emergent risks of the singularity around us in the same way that we do see hurricanes and floods and hunger that could be exacerbated by climate change in the future.
Absolutely. And the fact that, climate change may not rate as high an existential risk as some of the other ones we've talked about here doesn't somehow make it not worthy of serious action, including, some element of present day sacrifice. It becomes more like, it might have been your comparison to diabetes. I mean, to call something diabetes isn't to say, like, oh, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. Quite the opposite, actually. It requires daily interventions to stay healthy. And the same thing is going to be the case with climate change. So to me, it's, perhaps there's a need to, like, make it existential, to really, think it will drive home with people. But in reality, it's a big enough problem on its own to demand major attention without necessarily putting in the same class as, again, a nuclear war. And that's part of what we're dealing with here, is a lack of historical thinking. It's very hard, I think, for people to really, I don't know whether it's just more our time now, or this is just a fact of being human, hard to put the history in perspective, to understand that during the darkest days of the Cold War, that was a far greater danger than anything we're facing now. But lastly, the nature of climate change is that it continuously unfolds, which makes it very different than everything else I'm talking about here. Almost everything else, an asteroid strike hits or doesn't, and then catastrophe, volcano, same thing, a nuclear war, same thing, a bioengineered virus, a superintelligence, all these things kind of either they don't happen or they happen and then end of story. Whereas climate change just gives you a range of outcomes. We can argue all day about the different models that take you to different outcomes, but we know it's going to be a range. And that's, that makes it very different than what we have to deal with these other ones. But it also makes it more of the same nature of problems we deal with every day. So it is of an existential nature, but it is very different from the other ones I'm talking about.
Seems like another element of this is the different weight that these possible events have on our psyches. I don't think we might be terrified of an asteroid strike, but it doesn't say a whole lot about the human condition. When it comes to climate change, I think a lot of sort of guilt around our own consumption gets wrapped up in conversations about the existential risk of climate change. With something like a bioengineered virus or nuclear war, it's more related to sort of the hubris of humanity's reach for technological marvel. So I'm just curious, sort of how you think these different types of risk weigh on our actual psyches.
That's a really good point about climate change, and it's I think it's Per Espen-Stokes who had the idea of climate dissonance, essentially, which is to say, we know we're guilty. What makes climate change different than every other one of these risks, those are all outside us. Unless we're the ones hitting the button and shooting off the nuclear warheads, or we're the ones designing the virus, or what have you. we're separate as ordinary people from those existential risks. But this one, we're all involved in. Everything we do, all the energy we use, how many children we do or don't have, a million things all contribute to this. And obviously, some institutions, some people use far more or far more responsible. But at the end of the day, just about everyone, especially in the developed world, bears some responsibility. And I think that makes us very uncomfortable. We know that. We know it's important, especially if we know it's real. So I think that's why some people go to denialism. They sort of say, I don't want to deal with this, so either I'll just put it out of my mind altogether, I'll actively try to fight it off, deny it in a kind of psychological defense, or they might embrace it. But that's kind of the unusual, I think, for people. And so, again, that's what puts this separate, whereas these other risks are much more big policy risks, really, at the end of the day, that we're limited in what we can actually do as citizens. We can vote for leaders who talk about them, who, we can support leaders who support international treaties that help us deal with bioengineered weapons or CRISPR. But it's not like climate change where we all feel implicated in that kind of way. And I think at the end of the day, we're more likely to succeed there if we can remove that guilt, by which I mean, finding some technological solutions. Air capture is probably the most promising, or certainly the one that would work best, that essentially allows you to have your life, but also eliminates that problem. The idea that people are going to, and this is, I go into some detail in the book, I think the idea that people are really going to make those present sacrifices on their own as a unified, because it's going to take all of us, virtually all of us, is just unlikely, and we're better off trying to find solutions that fit with who we are as flawed human beings than we are to hope for the perfection of the human race.
You open the book with an excerpt from P.D. James's book, The Children of Men, which was adapted into a phenomenal movie by Alfonso Cuarón. And you mentioned, a couple other pop culture touchstones. You talked about movies about asteroid strikes, Deep Impact, Armageddon. Throughout the book, you also mentioned The Road by Cormac McCarthy, A Quiet Place, War of the Worlds. So I wanted to ask you what you think it is about the end of the world that is so attractive or so interesting to pop culture and to consumers.
Well, it's because it raises the stakes as high as they possibly can be. I think a great way to look at that is, these aren't the movies I talk about, but, look at Marvel movies now. I mean, they have to have the fate of the entire multiverse universe. I'm not really sure. Certainly like trillions of people. It can't just be, your friendly neighborhood Spiderman. Like, it has to be on those kind of scales. So I think that's part of it, like a desire to get bigger and bigger and to stand out. Will explain in part why you go toward, these end of the world subjects. Also, I think, we think, character is revealed in extreme situations. So it helps tell us about what we are as a person. Like, how will we actually deal with when all the stuff happens, when the worst of the worst days occur? What will that say about us as a people, as individuals, as characters? I think that's part of it. I think, it's some of it's just a fear story, in a sense, it's like a modern horror story. Some of these things are quite horrifying. We haven't experienced a nuclear war, but we've experienced a nuclear strike, and that's as horrifying a day that has ever occurred on this planet. So I think that's a big part of it, and I think part of it is also most of us live very comfortable lives, at least within, again, developed nations, and this is, I don't want to say, it's almost like existential risk tourism to a certain extent, like to really imagine what happens when everything gets stripped away. I think that's just exciting in kind of a scary kind of way, the same way that, a horror movie or a thriller is scary to put you in a situation where you're never likely to be, and how will you respond?
As a passionate consumer of most movies, including the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I have to, very heartily agree with your assessment there, while also noting that I do think we're actually seeing a kind of backlash to the every blockbuster superhero movie has to end with the possible end of the world. I think the ones that people tend to enjoy are, like the Black Panthers, which are not actually about the apocalypse, but are about much more human and political stakes that I think not just in superhero movies, but that people are finding more interesting and compelling. No offense to the subject matter of your book.
No problem.
Because you mentioned them both in this book, I want to ask you about two clocks, and those are the Doomsday Clock, created by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists several decades ago, and the Clock of the Long Now. So one after the other, can you tell me what those clocks are?
So the Doomsday Clock is the creation of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, as you say. It was invented, I believe it was first graced the cover of the first edition of that journal, and it was a graphic designer just sort of came up with it as a concept. She was married to a physicist who was on the board, and she thought, what symbolizes the subject of this? At a time just shortly after the first nuclear bombings, there was a sense of humanity, I think, being at risk in a way it had never been before. And she created this enduring icon. I mean, it's probably one of the best known icons really of the second half of the 20th century, I think. And it's meant to symbolize how close is humanity to midnight, to the end of the world. And since then, the editors of the bulletin, the scientists who are on their board, they meet every year and they kind of discuss, based off nuclear risks mostly, but also looking at things like climate change, looking at things like emerging technologies, AI, biotechnology, all the things covered really in this book. Where does humanity stand? And I opened the book, talking about this would be 2018, and it was set at 2.5 minutes to midnight. That's as close as it's ever been. It was tied with, I believe, 1953, which is around when the Soviet Union dropped its first hydrogen bomb. So that they're telling us essentially that that's the level of danger we're at right now, and they kept it at the same reading for 2019 as well. And look, there's no way to sort of hive off in 15-second segments, how close we are or not to the apocalypse. But it is, I think, a valuable symbol more than anything else. And symbols have a lot of power in that way. And that's one that comes really out of that post World War II, those scientists who many of whom were actually involved in the Manhattan Project, who then reacted in horror to what they had essentially helped unleash on the world. So to me, it has that most meaning within the realm of science, within the realm of scientists trying to act in policy, in politics, and in society, and especially being concerned about what is the product of science, what can it do to us. So that's one side. The Clock of the Long Now is the product of the Long Now Foundation. It's actually being built, I believe, in Texas, and it's meant to be a clock that will ring for 10,000 years. That will keep ringing throughout the entire period of that time. And what that's really meant to symbolize is confidence in there actually being a future for humanity. Imagining, as Alexander Rose, who's the executive director of the Long Now Foundation, told me, it's not that we're at the end of a 10,000-year story, but we're in the middle of a 20,000-year story. And that's certainly inspiring to me, simply the idea that anyone has confidence that there will be any human beings to actually hear that clock chime in 10,000 years' time. And, again, as a sort of symbol for the fortitude of the human race, as a symbol for thinking about the long term, because you can't really act for the long term unless you really believe it will happen. And that's the first step to actually imagining what kind of future you really want. The clock is a pretty impressive symbol. That said, it's very different in that, the Doomsday Clock is meant to be trumpeted out to the world. It's put on, in newspapers. There's a press conference about it every year. The Clock of the Long Now is going to be in I think a salt mine or something like that in Texas, and not something everyone can go and see. So more of an elite project, perhaps. But that said, something I think that really more of us could benefit by really taking on, by really believing. I don't think anyone's, despite the fact I've just written a book about the end of the world, I don't think anyone really benefits from believing that the end of the world is inevitable and coming our way. We really have to believe that there's going to be more to this for our children, our grandchildren, so forth and so on.
Yeah, as symbols go, I've always been a much bigger fan of the Clock of the Long Now. And I should say I know Xander and Stuart Brand, who founded the Long Now Foundation, is on the board of the Breakthrough Institute. And less of a fan personally of the Doomsday Clock, not least because it's been sort of ticking like closer and farther to midnight for like 70 years now, and it's hard for me to understand what the sort of actual value of that is. On the other hand, it does communicate a direness that is real in the world, not just climate change, not just nuclear war, and obviously it works. They update the clock once a year, and it generates a lot of headlines. And like you say, the Clock of the Long Now is almost sort of intentionally designed to be hidden. It kind of has to be buried in a mountain to click for so long, or to tick for so long. And so, as symbols go, I sort of stop there in my evaluation of them. I love the Clock of the Long Now. I do agree with your point earlier, though, that I don't know how long-term humans can think or plan, even as we design these incredible pieces of engineering and art and bury them in a mountain.
Yeah, I think, in a way we were able to think in a longer term in the past. When you look at buildings like Notre Dame Cathedral, for instance, that took generations to build, the pyramids, the Great Wall of China, obviously. That to embark on a project like that is to believe that there is going to be future, generations hence, and there was less existential risk back then. Clearly, of course, human life itself was a lot more vulnerable, just period, at that time. Now it seems like this is part of a life that feels sped up, a present shock that we all live through. So it's hard to really believe. It's also I think it's the sheer speed at which technology is evolving. It's it's hard to imagine what's life going to be like in 20 years, 30 years. I mean, in reality, probably not hugely different. Who knows? We'll be communicated in different ways because that's what seems to be changing faster than anything else. But, otherwise it may not actually look that different, but it's really hard, I think, to get our head around that. And if that's the case, it's hard to think about something that will be multi-generational. It's interesting that Jeff Bezos, who I talk about a little bit in the book about his space exploration, his efforts there, when he was talking about that, it's easy to make fun of him because it seems absurd for him to be spending billions of dollars to put humans into space when there are so many technical challenges to it. It's going to take decades, if not longer. There's so much to do on this planet. But that said, I mean, there's also something valuable in that, I think. There's something valuable in actually imagining what we will live like and how can we live like and how can we improve in 100 years' time and not merely focus on all that we think we're going to lose in the meantime.
So given the dire nature of the subject matter of this book, I'm particularly interested to ask you the question that I try to close these interviews with, which is, tell me something that you're optimistic about in the world, or tell me something that gives you hope in the world, and maybe something that you found in researching and writing this book.
Well, I certainly feel optimistic in the sense that we're able to respond to these risks in a way that I didn't quite know. We're able to respond to a risk like asteroids. We actually have a space program that can detect them. We have the theoretical ability to deflect them in the future. And that's something that no human being has ever had before. We were vulnerable to this up until now, and now we actually can put it away. I'm hopeful in that even with these new risks coming from emerging technologies like biotech, which to me is probably the biggest one over the near term, just because of the amount of damage it could do if you were actually able to engineer truly dangerous viruses, you're going to have a credible amount of good to come out of that. You will have new medicines. We're already seeing that. You'll be able to abolish illness that would never have been possible before. So what makes me feel more optimistic really is that even those aspects of what we're doing that do bring more risk to us will bring benefits as well. The challenge with these dual-use technologies is figuring out how to get the best of both and how to minimize the worst. Can we do that? That's where I get a little skeptical, but I also look to the past and, we've handled these challenges before. We've faced challenges around, how will we get fertilizer to feed ourselves? Well, we invent a new process that can create it artificially. Well, that creates new problems, so we have to solve that. I mean, to me, I look at the history of humanity, at least since industrial times, and it's the use of technology to solve one problem that tends to create another one, and that hopefully gets solved, and so forth and so on. So there's no time when we stop running. There's no time when we stop racing. We just keep trying to get better. One of these days it might all go wrong, but I can't help feeling optimistic because, that's what we seem to be doing. We ultimately are problem solvers, and maybe we'll forget how to do that. Maybe we'll be so, wrapped up in politics and any kind of limited thinking, I suppose, that we'll lose that ability. But I still have a lot of hope in us as a species that not only will we survive, but, and endure, but will, improve in the future.
It's perversely comforting, the idea that the end times will always be with us in one way or another. Even as we solve some problems, we create new ones, but that sort of adds to the creativity and the accomplishments of our species.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is how we've always lived. We've lived in far worse circumstances than we are now, and I think we can handle far worse circumstances in the future. I hope so, at the very least. There's a downside to that as well. There's a possibility that we pass a certain point and we lose that ability, or we are hit by something we simply can't respond to, and we go the way that most of the species that have ever lived on this planet have gone. But I don't think that's going to happen quite yet. I think the human story has a few more chapters to be written.
Well, with that, Bryan Walsh, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you get your podcasts. Like I mentioned at the top, please send us your questions for our upcoming AMA episode, either by emailing info@thebreakthrough.org or tweeting at the BTI or at a Trembath. I want to again thank my guest, Bryan Walsh, and our producers, Alyssa Kadaman and Tali Perlman. Catch you next time.